Thank you very much. And what a pleasure to be back here in Jaipur. Always a wonderful, wonderful event. And thank you for coming to this. I know the great joy of Jaipur is that there's always so much happening at the same time. So thank you for being here with us. I think Eurasian Steppe, it's such an interesting and actually little discussed part of the world. I mean, it's as we're going to hear, it's shaped our world, and yet there hasn't been enough written about it. So Warwick's mega tome here, the Eurasian Steppe, is a welcome addition. Warwick, welcome. It would be good to start just with the description of, firstly, the scope of the steppe, but also of what it looks like.
The image you see at the moment gives a bit of an idea of what the steppe is. In fact, that's the Arjan Plain in South Siberia. And I'll return to that probably later on. But the steppe is probably the world's largest geographical feature, apart from the oceans, of course. It's an area of grasslands, roughly equivalent to the savanna in Africa or the prairies in America, although there's no exact equivalence. And it stretches from Hungary all the way through to eastern Siberia, a simply vast area. In some ways, it's probably better to be compared to the oceans rather than a land feature, with the various limits on the edge of it, the forest belt, mountains, desert belt, more like the land that are beached up. Indeed, one authority on the steppe compared the steppe to the ocean, the cities on the steppe to the caravan cities to islands, and the various raiders from the steppe to pirates. I mean, that goes only so far. But it is characterized by this immense grassland. In the further east, in Siberia, the grassland has very limited agricultural potential. This has meant that it's been a natural area for pasturage ever since earliest history. Very, very limited. And has resisted most attempts to try and cultivate it. Khrushchev's virgin lands efforts in the 1950s were a total disaster. On the western steppe, however, notably in Ukraine, it is very fertile. This is because the western steppe is more affected by the warm air coming in from the Atlantic Ocean and is more fertile. And as we know to our cost this day, that area has been, especially in Ukraine, has been a breadbasket. What drew me to the steppe in the first place was one winter in Afghanistan in the early 70s, crossing over the Hindu Kush and finally getting north of the Hindu Kush and seeing this vast, vast area of utter flatness. Yesterday, John Kay talked about the Himalayas, the mountains, the heights, and the steppe is about the exact opposite, exact flatness. And this flatness just draws one in. One wants to see what's beyond, go to the edge of it and beyond. I only got to the edge of it in 2019 when I finally got to Vladivostok. But it is this vast, vast area. Certainly in the 70s, one couldn't travel in it at all. It was all part of the Soviet Union. But since then, I think I've traveled the length and breadth of it and finally beginning to understand a little bit about it.
It's said that if you got on your horse in the west of the steppe and on the Hungarian plain, just as the ice is melting, and you went east, that you could get to the eastern side and to China just as things start to freeze again. So theoretically, you could cross this huge landmass in a full season. But for most of its history, that's not the case of people crossing it. So can you tell us a bit about the ethnicities of the people who live there? What sort of people have inhabited this hostile environment?
Well, it can be summed up very, very simply in three different linguistic groups. The Iranians or Iranic peoples, the Scythians especially, Later on, the Turks, and currently the Slavs, the Russians. It has been this movement of almost entirely east-west movements because of what I talked about, the nature of the steppe just a while ago, the warmer climate in the west as opposed to much colder areas in Siberia. And because of that, there's this movement of peoples ever since earlier prehistory. At the same time, the area has also seen permanence. In earliest prehistory, for example, as far back as 5000 BC, the western steppe in southern Ukraine and Moldova saw settlements that were much larger and older than the earliest cities in Mesopotamia. This is not to say that these enormous settlements were the world's first cities. Archaeologists are very careful to talk about them as simply gigantic settlements and not just cities. But nonetheless, the steppe has been characterized by permanence as well as this extraordinary movement.
Out of the steppes have come two things that absolutely changed the nature of life in Mesopotamia and the Middle East in early history. And you write about them: the development of the composite bow and the taming of the horse and the use of the horse bit. Can you tell us about how those came about?
The horse, of course, is the natural animal of the steppe. The steppe horse is very, very hardy. It can forage through deep snow when other species can't. So it is the natural animal for the steppes and for people on the steppe. And the only way to survive is through movement, to move around. The pasturage was very, very limited. So in the east, at least, it wasn't possible for permanent settlement. People had to migrate. The way to do that was on the horse. At the same time, the way to live, to feed yourself, was by hunting. And this led to the development of the composite bow, a bow not just made of wood, but of sinew and bone as well, that was very effective at long range. So the horse and the bow were the natural products of having to survive on the steppe. And these two elements also meant that steppe people would often be victorious against the great sedentary empires of antiquity, being able to constantly on the move. Every member of a steppe tribe would be almost a natural soldier. There'd be training, rapid lines of command, and this incredible power of the composite bow. It also meant that they traveled very, very lightly, these steppe nomads, without the cumbersome entourage of the great sedentary empires. It also meant that all their food supplies were on the hoof. The horse, of course, was a source of food, but also the other animals which they had with them, sheep, cattle. This meant that they had one advantage over the sedentary armies, which were dependent upon cereals and massive baggage trains, which they had to bring along with them, let alone having to return at harvest time to harvest the cereals. The steppe nomads were incredibly mobile because of these two main developments that happened early on in the steppe.
You mentioned the Scythians earlier on, and there's a great story of the Persian Emperor Darius. This is in relation to the difference between Scythians and more settled people, where Darius goes to try and conquer the Scythians, and I think Herodotus talks about an army of 700,000, so this huge army with a massive supply line, and the Scythians just keep on moving away and move further and further and further, and eventually Darius sends a fast messenger to the Scythian king and says, "Why won't you stand and fight?" And the Scythian says, "Why would we fight? We have no cities that we fear you might destroy. We have no crops you could burn. We're just doing what we always do. We just keep on moving. And this is a fundamental difference, obviously, between mobile and settled communities. But the consequence of these people moving around and also knocking each other, because there's not just one tribe living on the steppes, there's lots of them, has shaped, for instance, European history in the way that with the Huns and many others coming and bringing down the Roman Empire. Could you tell us a bit about how that happened, that sequence of movements of tribes?
The one characteristic of the steppe is a knock-on effect. Something that would happen at one end, usually the eastern end. It could be a drying up of pastures, it could be a conflict, or nothing at all. But there would be this classic knock-on effect. The Huns being evicted from the walls of China, for example, several generations later, would be battering at the walls of Rome. And it wouldn't be one direct movement, it'd be indirect. One group of people would knock against one, and then against the next, and the next, and the next. The various Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire at the end of antiquity were themselves fleeing this far greater movement of peoples further east, which were the Huns. The Huns themselves were the result of movement in the Far East, which have eventually deflected them away from travelling further east onto the Eurasian steppe, and then, in the end, not only invading Europe, of course, but also, as we know, coming down into India as well. Mihrakula, the leader of the Huns in India, has as much the same reputation as Attila the Hun does in Europe. So it's a knock-on effect. And this is one of the characteristics of the movement across the steppes throughout history.
What happens to for instance, to the Huns when they arrive in the Roman world? Do they lose their nomadism? Do they lose their old traditions, or do they shape the Roman world with them?
Well, there's a lot of divergence of opinion on them. The Huns are almost, although they figure very, very largely in the end of antiquity, as one of the least known peoples that have come from the steppe. We don't even really know what language they spoke. I mean, there were the Germanic invasions. Later on, there were the Turkish invasions. We know their language. The Huns generally thought that they spoke a Turco-Mongolian language, but there's very, very little trace of their speech left behind. Contrary to what a lot of people imagine, a lot of people in Hungary especially, the Hungarians are not the descendants of the Huns at all. I
don't think they know that in Hungary.
Well, no, perhaps they don't. And in Hungary, Attila is a popular boy's name. But the Hungarians have been traced back to the Onogur Turks, who originated to the northwest of the Urals. And Onogur and Magyar are related words. That's a long, long story anyway. And the Huns have left in Europe, very, very, in the east, the Huns on the borders of China have left records, even settled remains, very rich burials, very rich art. But in the west, in Europe, almost no trace. There are burials, there are no settlements at all. They seem to disappear into history as mysteriously as when they appeared out from the steppe. So there's, very, very little trace. And to this day, there's still no consensus at all in scholarship as to who exactly the Huns were.
You mentioned language, and this has been one of the great gifts of the steppes to the world, which is Indo-European, first identified in a way here in India in the 1700s by a British High Court judge,
Sir William Jones.
Jones. Tell us more about that, about Indo-European and Sanskrit and those connections.
I think somewhere in the book I write, the book covers so many subjects and so much of history. There's bound to be something in it that will annoy everybody. And Indo-European origins is a hot potato. It's very, very controversial. And the origin of the Indo-European languages has bounced around from Anatolia to the Western Steppe, to the Urals, to Siberia, to India. There's been many, many theories. There is now rapidly gaining a consensus that the Indo-European language developed roughly to the west of the Urals in what's now Russia. But it's become a very controversial subject because with the Indo-European languages, people have then thought if there's a language, there must be a people. And if there's a people, how did they come? What was their homeland? And then it's developed even further. If there's a people, are they us, whoever us is? And it's taken extreme forms. As everybody knows, the idea of the Aryan race under the Nazis. But even that extreme has not quite been put to bed. There are rather sinister Aryan supremacists in both America and in Russia. But what one has to emphasize above all, that the Indo-European languages and the original Indo-European language is nothing more than that. It's language, it's not people. To take a very obvious example, if you get a Bengali speaking and stand him or her next to an Icelandic speaking person, they're very, very different people. So it is just language, it's nothing more than that, and I don't think one can emphasize that too much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So you have this huge land corridor between the two great poles of civilization, as called in the ancient world, between China and Europe, the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire. And you talking about controversy, you have rather controversially said there is no such thing as a Silk Road, but there is clearly a passage of goods, people, and ideas that moves across this huge landmass. So if there isn't a Silk Road, what do you think there is?
I've become rather a bore about the Silk Road, saying quite bluntly that there was no such thing.
Obviously, Peter Frankopan would be taking issue with you.
Yes, and in fact, one of the greatest scholars of the Silk Road, Susan Whitfield, has said in her latest big glossy book, Thames and Hudson, called The Silk Roads, and her very first words in the book is that there never was any Silk Road. It would take too long to explain. I mean, the Silk Road was invented in the 1870s by Baron von Richthofen, a German explorer of Central Asia. There was movement, of course. Of course there was movement. There was movement from Africa into Europe. There was movement between North and South America. I mean, there's always been movement. And the Eurasian Steppe has been an area of movement above all. So I don't say that there was no such thing as movement. There certainly was, quite the contrary, a huge amount of movement of people and ideas. Silk, almost certainly not. That came via the sea into Europe, via India. Then it's gone to say that, there was a maritime Silk Route, which is a bit of a contradiction, or maritime Silk Road. It would take far too long here. If you wanted me to answer that question properly, I would talk for about the next 6 hours before taking breath, and then by about midnight you'd be begging for mercy. So it's a very long, complicated question.
Okay, but mention of the maritime brings us to rather sort of tangentially to the empires. Let's talk more about the empires, and particularly the Mongols, who are sort of the great empire that comes out of the steppes and controls the entirety for a certain period. And if you can name a nomadic leader out of history, then two of them are going to be Mongols. It's going to be Genghis Khan and Timur or Tamerlane. Perhaps you could talk about the rise of the Mongolia. I mean, curiously, you didn't mention Mongolia in your description of the steppes, but I'm assuming you do include it.
Oh, very much so. Very much so, Mongolia, and that was one of the areas where we know about the early Huns as well. So it does figure enormously. There have been empires of the steppe even before the Mongols. Most famously, in the Middle Ages, there was a huge and very powerful Jewish empire, the Khazars, of which few have ever heard of. Indeed, many Jews I've known have never ever heard of the Khazars. That is yet another hot potato. The Khazars was a Turkish-speaking group who adopted Judaism and was one of the formidable great powers of the steppe between Europe and Asia, roughly north of the Black and Caspian Seas. So there were precedents for the Mongol Empire. There was even a dress rehearsal of the Mongols by another Mongol group, that happened before and reached as far as Central Asia. The rise of the Mongols was initially just a local affair, with Genghis Khan uniting all the tribes, the various different tribes in Mongolia, and creating not so much an empire, but a centralized Mongolian state that set its eyes mainly on China, but also wishing to make peaceful overtures to another great power on the steppe, the Khwarezm-Shahs near the Aral Sea. So sent a group of traders from there to make diplomatic overtures. In sensitivity to the Muslim character of the Khwarezm-Shahs, the traders were all Muslim, and the Khwarezm-Shahs had them all slaughtered and all the goods confiscated. Even then, Genghis Khan wasn't provoked, so he had another delegation sent, which were captured and again slaughtered. Well, such an affront Genghis Khan couldn't ignore. So that was when he set his huge war machine westwards, initially into Central Asia, but then beyond into Europe and even as far as Western Europe. The initial invasion got as far as Poland and Austria, and in 1241, at the Battle of Liegnitz in Poland, when Europe was finally woken up to this enormous challenge, and Europe sent the greatest army it could possibly have, with troops drawn from France, the Knights Hospitallers, troops from all over Europe were sent against a far smaller Mongol army in 1241, and it was absolutely annihilated. And there's no doubt at all that the great empires, the great Muslim empires, the great Chinese empires, had not withstood the Mongol impact. There's no doubt that Western Europe would have been overrun completely by the Mongols. Except for one thing. In this invasion of Europe, the greatest generals that the Mongols had, and all of the main descendants of Genghis Khan, his sons, were put into the field. But at that time, Europe was saved at the 11th hour by the death of the great Khan in Mongolia. So all the leaders of the Mongol armies had to return to Mongolia to decide who the successor was. So Europe had a reprieve. But the Mongols remained on the steppe, and even on the western steppe, and still are there to this day, which perhaps I'll mention in a moment.
Okay, well, after that, there comes an even greater. I mean, I don't know whether you consider Timur to be Mongol or Turkic, but either way, there comes an even greater empire, certainly greater in terms of landmass.
Well, not greater. No, Timur's empire was certainly not as big as the initial Mongol empire. But Timur's empire was certainly, it originated in not quite on the steppe, but in Central Asia. He numbered Genghis Khan on his as an ancestor on his mother's side. He was a Chagatai Turk, of course. Turkish was his language. And it was like the Mongol Holocaust all over again. But Timur and his descendants did leave behind a great sedentary civilization. First of all, Timur's establishment of his capital at Samarkand. But Samarkand was only a one-generation capital. His son and successor moved the capital to Herat in Afghanistan, which then became the capital of the Timurid Empire, and that saw the true flouriation of the Timurids, and it was a great period of painting, of poetry, of literature, the arts, and of architecture as well, gigantic architecture that characterized the Timurid period. But it's one of the effects of the steppe, but one of these knock-on effects that will have a movement on the steppe that will eventually be felt in Central Asia, and felt as far away as, well, this tent, the Mughal tent, eventually the Mughals coming into India. So that's...
one of the things that struck me most about these Mughal empires was the openness of the steppes in that time, in that there are relatively few physical or trade barriers. This is the time, obviously, when people like Marco Polo were heading there, but lots and lots of other Europeans going to Karakoram or elsewhere in the Mongol Empire to trade. And out of this exchange, and it's said at this time that a young woman could walk with a gold bowl on her head and sort of be unafraid of being mugged. And there was the Mongol post houses, in the same way that the Romans had theirs. These effectively roads. I mean, we won't call them silk roads, but trade routes that were set up to encourage trade, because the whole idea of the Mongol Empire was open trade. But out of this comes an exchange of ideas and of technology that effectively reshapes the world. And this seems to me to be the most important moment of steppe history. Its greatest gift, apart from Indo-European language, is what comes across from east to west, and the consequences of what Europe does with it.
Yes, indeed. In fact, to get back to the Silk Road, there was no such open trade across this vast area in antiquity. But this did happen with the Mongol Empire. For the first time, this vast area of Eurasia was unified. And there was trade. And this is one of the effects that it had certainly on Europe, but particularly on Russia as well. For the first time, Russia, and to a lesser extent Europe, was brought into a world trading system where there was free travel right across this vast area. Marco Polo we all know about, but there were many other travelers as well that traveled to the court of Karakoram in Mongolia. There was even a famous traveler from China, Rabban Salma from Beijing, who traveled all the way west to the court of Edward I of England. So it was a two-way travel, but also this trading system was brought into place. And this had a huge effect on Russia especially. Russia, up until that time, was all these different little princely states, but it brought it into this world system, and that was an effect of the Mongol Empire. Apart from its initial destruction, there was this period of prosperity and trade.
But I was referring to the arrival of gunpowder, the compass, and paper into Europe, all of which come across the steppe into Europe, and which are sort of in a way weaponized by Europe and lead to the voyages of exploration, the search for a sea route to India, and partly because of the Mongol control of the land route, and through that the transformation of the world. I mean, the discovery of the New World, and none of that would have happened had there not been this transfer of technology and ideas across the steppe.
Yes, certainly there was that, and again, this is one of the arguments I use against the existence of a Silk Road. All these things that moved across the steppe religion, gunpowder, silk, paper, and so forth. They work out in antiquity, that is, before the Mongols, at the average speed of a snail. There wasn't this rapid movement in antiquity. There was in the Mongol period, and certainly probably a much more destructive thing that was brought by the Mongols was, as you say, gunpowder. The other destructive thing that was brought by the Mongols was germ warfare, and this happened during a Mongol siege of the port of Kaffa on the Black Sea, when they flung decapitated heads over the walls infected with the plague. And that was brought on initially a Genoese ship from the Black Sea down into the Mediterranean, where into initially Sicily, where all of the sailors were almost dead with plague. And then from that, plague entered Europe and wiped out, well, some estimates up to 2/3 the population of Europe. So yes, it wasn't all these benefits that were brought by the Mongols either.
Okay. We're obviously going to run out of time.
Inevitably.
Yeah, we know that. And I want you to talk a little bit about the shaping of modern Russia and the modern idea of Russia as we're living through this terrible moment in time,
Yeah.
of the steppes, because everything at the moment is focused on the Russian claim to Ukraine and this sense of Putin's idea of a sort of that Ukraine is Russian. Is he going to look east? Does he have a right to look east?
One thing you have to remember about Russia is that through the Middle Ages, Russia was on a knife edge. The first state to be established on Russian territory was Muslim, and that's the Bulgar state on the Middle Volga. And the Bulgar Khan even wrote to, I think, Sviatoslav of Kiev to convert to Islam. The other great state of the Middle Age, of the 10th century, was this Jewish state of the Khazars, and they tried to convert the Russians to Judaism. And there was this swing. The idea that Russia is Orthodox and Slavic there was no inevitability about that. It was simply a matter of circumstance. And I think I end my book that Russia was always on a knife edge, and perhaps that is still so. But the effect that the Mongols had on Russia is that it unified it. Up to the Mongol invasions, Russia was all these different independent states, Muscovy, Vladimir, Kiev, Novgorod, and so on and so forth. There was no inevitability, just as there was no inevitability of the unification of Italy or Germany until the 19th century. But the Mongols unified Russia, and in many ways, the Russian state is a product of the Mongol Empire, and the Mongol but it also meant that the Mongols wanted somebody to collect all the taxes, and so they chose Moscow as the one state where they could look to collect their taxes, and this allowed for the emergence of Moscow as the center of Russia. There are many, many other influences as well, and even up until today, many of the great names of Russia, and Akhmatova, Rudolf Nureyev, Tsar Boris Godunov, General Suvorov, the hero of the War of 1814, who entered Paris. And so many, many names in Russia, they are Tatar, Mongol names. And it's left its imprint on almost every aspect and every people in almost every aspect of Russia today.
Well, so it's
been fundamental.
Yes, and that urge was behind the Russian invasion of Crimea, which was a Tatar state.
Yes.
But my question was, do you think that Russia has ambitions beyond its current borders?
Well,
because of its connection to the steppes.
There was a report which I actually cite in my book in 2009 by a Kremlin strategist whose name, which was Igor Panarin, who in 2009 wrote that Russia under Putin, as part of a movement called a neo-Eurasianist movement, will reincorporate all of the former Soviet Union, all of the former satellite states of the Soviet Union, all of the former Russian Empire, and even Siberia itself, that Putin, under Russia, intends to reincorporate that. As a blueprint for the invasion of Ukraine, you cannot get better. And one can cite chapter and verse of that 2009 report.
Very good. Thank you. Now, we have time for some questions. I think there's a microphone going around. Yep, here it comes. Dun, 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 dun. Hands up. There's a gentleman in the back and one on the aisle in blue.
Thanks for the wonderful session. So you were talking about Genghis Khan and all of his military work, but what I want to know is, was he a good monarch to his own people?
Well, it depends what you call his own people. One of the tribal groups, one of the Mongol tribal groups, ironically the Tatars, who eventually gave the name to all of the Mongols, he tried to annihilate. So he wasn't always good to his own people. He wasn't a nationalist leader in that sense, although since independence, Mongolia has made Genghis Khan into a great Mongolian nationalist. So no, he wasn't all good to his own people. I mean, like any great leader, any great conqueror, they're not always wonderful for their own people. But that having said, he was even worse to many other peoples as well. And in fact, the Mongol conquest is probably one of the world's only recorded examples of complete genocide. And this is total wiping out of the Tangut people of China. Genghis Khan even considered wiping out half the male population of China. So it's, yeah. In that sense, yes, he was good to his own people, but it's all relative.
Okay, next question. Yes, here the gentleman standing up.
So my question is around the Aryan migration theory. Earlier it was known as the Aryan invasion theory, right? So what are your views on the alternate theories that have been propounded, including the Out of India theory right now?
About the Aryan invasions of India?
Yeah, the Aryan invasion. Right now it's known as the Aryan migration. They've changed the name, but the controversy remains the same.
Well, first of all, as I emphasized before, the Aryans were not a people, they were a language group. And it's now thought, in any case, that previously it was thought that the Aryans invaded India in, I think, about 1700, between 1700 and 1500 BC. It's now more of a consensus that there wasn't an invasion at all. It was a movement of languages, a movement of peoples. Perhaps there was an elite. There is no general consensus, and certainly what consensus there is that it wasn't an actual invasion at all.
Okay, there's a hand up in the front, lady in the front.
Hi, I want to come back to the Mongols and their relationship with the Turks. So ethnically, what were the Mongols and how did they influence the Turks? And also, can you tell us a little bit about how that whole region turned Muslim and then became, in a way, the arm of conquest out of Central Asia into Europe and into India, a Muslim conquest?
That's several questions. But first of all, Turks and Mongols belong to closely related languages, and I do emphasize languages rather than race. Again, when you talk about the Turks, when you look at Turks in, say, Xinjiang, and compare them to a Turk in Istanbul, they look very, very different peoples. So it is language. There's a Turco-Mongolian language, and that goes back to another earlier language group that includes languages like Finnish and Hungarian as well. So they're related linguistically. and their original homeland, the original homeland of the Turks, was actually further east than the Mongols themselves. As for how they became Muslim, one author of the steppe and the peoples there has drawn attention that almost none of the great steppe groups ever resisted ultimately any of the world religions, any of the major world religions. The Uyghurs became Manichaean, the Khazars became Jewish, the Russians became Christian, the Ilkhanids, which were one of the descendants of the Mongols, became Muslim. The Mongols themselves became Tibetan Buddhist. So none of them resisted the attraction of these major world religions, probably because for them, a bit like, well, the Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire, and the Germans eventually became Christians. And the same with the Turks in Central Asia, them adopting Islam. For them, the religion represented power, prosperity, wealth, permanence. They were the religions of powerful sedentary empires. It was the attraction that these big world religions represented, not necessarily the message themselves. It was these great sedentary empires that in the end, although they could never resist them militarily, in terms of religion, the steppe peoples were in the end subjected to them. I hope that answers the question, or one of the questions at least.
There's a couple of hands up here.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'll just take a minute. Could you tell us a little more about the Golden Horde and the Huns, and who were they, and exactly what role did they play in shaping the history of the steppe?
The Golden Horde was in the end, Genghis Khan's empire was so big that it split up into component parts. The Chinese part became the Yuan, the Iranian Middle Eastern part became the Ilkhanids, the Central Asian part became the Chagatai, the European part, mainly Russian, became the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was very much a European term to apply to the Western Khanate. They themselves knew themselves as the Kipchak horde. The word horde exists in English as horde, Urdu, it's the same word. It just means the army. The Huns were much earlier, of course, and were quite separate from the Mongols. As I emphasized before, we don't really know who they are. But as for the Golden Horde, they remained in Europe under different names. And today, what's very, very little known in Europe is that Europe includes a Mongol state, the Republic of Kalmykia, on the southern Russian steppe between Astrakhan and Rostov-on-Don. The Republic of Kalmykia, it's within the Russian Federation. It's Mongolian. Its official religion is Tibetan Buddhist. So the Mongols remained and still remain as a permanent part of Europe today.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. This gentleman here. Go on.
Hi, you mentioned that the Huns kind of disappeared into Western Europe. In India, when the Huns came in, now India notoriously has a lot of marriage within ethnic groups. Is there any theory on what happened to Huns that migrated to India and whether they're noticeable in any ethnic group in India today?
Yes, indeed, there is. There is a suggestion, and I don't know how much evidence there is, that the Huns are where we are sitting today, that the Hun element entered the Rajputs themselves. But it's a suggestion, and there's not much evidence. There is much more concrete evidence of the earlier Scythian entries into India. Two groups of Scythians entered India, but the southern group coming through Sakistan, the Sakas Scythian, created a kingdom in the southern Indus River, Indo-Scythia in the Greek sources, Sakadvipa in Sanskrit, and eventually became the Todas of the Nilgiri Hills. And that, I believe, is on fairly good ethnic, archaeological, and linguistic grounds. But the Huns, well, maybe they're sitting here.
And on that, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much to Warwick Ball and Anthony Sattin for this very intriguing discussion.